believe we were doing it even as we were throwing the soup.
We were put in a van, and that was the last time I felt freedom.
I had no idea that 2 years was on the cards.
If you do go to prison, is that something you can cope with? And he said yes.
I do feel guilty because ultimately I have chosen this over her.
The single most effective way to change society is to engage in resistance to going to prison.
A quick warning, this episode includes discussion of suicide.
I saw my parents waiting there for me, and I stepped past the gate and just froze, and I didn't know what to do because I hadn't been told what to do past that point. And there was no one there saying, okay, go on, you're free to go now. I just stepped past the gate and it was just done.
In September 2024, Anna Holland was sentenced to 20 months in prison after throwing a tin of soup at Bangkok Sunflowers. But on a cold, wet morning in late January 2025, after just 4 months in prison, they were out. And they had no idea what to do next.
I'd spent every single day of my time in prison fantasising about this day when I would leave, and it still didn't feel like I'd mentally left. I don't think there was really any thought going on in my head other than, God, what do I do now?
As their parents began the 500-mile drive from prison in Surrey back to Anna's university in Newcastle, Anna was flooded with relief, but also with fear.
Every time, a police car went past on the motorway or something, I thought it was for me and that they were going, no, there's been a mistake, we've got to take you back.
That fear wasn't totally unfounded. Anna may be out of prison, but one wrong move and they could go right back. That's because Anna is technically still serving their sentence, just not in prison, meaning there are some pretty restrictive rules they have to stick to. Anna has to wear a GPS tag on their ankle that alerts the police if they're not at home during the curfew. They also can't enter the National Gallery, where the soup action took place. They can't contact Phoebe Plummer, the Just Stop Oil activist who also participated in the souping.
While I was in prison, I spent almost every day just daydreaming about coming back to my real life. And if I break any of these conditions, I get recalled to prison straight away.
Perhaps worst of all for Anna, they aren't allowed to do any kind of activism.
I want to be able to help those people prepare for prison. I want to join the team that helped me so much before I came into prison. And not being able to do that, I'm finding really difficult. Just being banned from protest completely is horrible.
So they're finally out. But like other Just Stop Oil activists who've made it through prison, they're uncertain about what to do now and where to direct their energy. And this raises some pretty big questions, not just for Anna, but for Just Stop Oil. I'm Clare Heimer.
And I'm Rivkah Brown. And you're listening to Committed, a podcast about people who have gone to prison for a cause they believe in. You're joining us at episode 4. In episode 1, we found out why Just Stop Oil activists gave up their ordinary lives to take radical climate action. In episode 2, we took you behind bars to see what life's really like for activists on the inside. In episode 3, we heard about the heartbreak of loving someone in prison, someone who's chosen activism over you.
In this episode, life after prison. As activists emerge from confinement, we want to know, how free are they? Would they risk prison again, or is once enough for a lifetime? Did their actions really advance their cause? And was it all worth it?
We'll also talk to Roger Hallam, one of the founders of Just Stop Oil, who's currently in prison himself. We'll ask him whether he feels any guilt about the large number of Just Stop Oil activists in prison.
Roger has long been vocal in his belief that going to prison is the most effective way to change politics. 3 years on from founding Just Stop Oil, does he still think so? And with the group's shock announcement at the end of March that it's quitting direct action, what will its most committed activists, both in and out of prison, do next?
So Claire, tell us, why was Anna released so early?
Well, it's because they're technically still serving their sentence, just in the community rather than in prison. Over the past couple of decades, Successive governments have tried to deal with the massive problem of prison overcrowding by allowing people to serve more of their sentences outside of prison, though with strict conditions. Anna's GPS tag will stay on until the end of May. Their other licence conditions will last until the end of their 20-month sentence. It's easier than you might think to break your licence conditions, and sometimes it's not even your fault. In January 2025, 77-year-old Just Stop Oil activist Gay Delap was recalled to prison for being unlawfully at large. That makes it sound like Gay is a hardened criminal, but actually what had happened was that government contractors couldn't find a GPS tag small enough for her wrist. Anna worries that they could find themselves in a similar ridiculous situation. Here's Anna speaking to me not long after they left prison.
There's no judicial process, there's no way for me to sort of present my side of the story, say if it was an accident or a misunderstanding. I would just end up back in prison.
Prisoners' licence conditions are also often extremely vague. Anna told me that one particular rule feels like it's designed to instill the maximum amount of paranoia.
The licence condition that I'm most concerned about is that I'm not allowed to contribute in any way to any meetings, gatherings, or websites. And that's an incredibly vague condition, which does make me nervous because it doesn't specify that it's just for protest-related meetings. So technically, could going to my university seminar be a breach of my licence condition? Could meeting up with friends be a breach?
This rule feels particularly harsh to me because before going to prison, Anna wasn't just involved in the climate movement. They were also active in the Palestine movement. So this isn't just a ban on the kind of activism that wound them up in prison. It's a ban on being an activist altogether.
It's not just Anna who's spinning out over this particular licence condition. Remember George Simonson, the M25 gantry climber? He got released on licence at around the same time as Anna in late January 2025, after serving about 5 months of his 2-year sentence. Just before he was released, George told me that this rule, not contributing to meetings or websites, was the one he was most worried about.
Because my license condition is so broad, it basically means that I need to ask permission for any contact that I have with people, including sending people a message via social media or something. So when I would ask my probation officer this, I'd be like, so can I send people a message on Instagram? And she said, well, who are you messaging? And to me, that was just are you kidding me?
The idea that George is going to check in with his probation officer about every Instagram DM he wants to send is frankly bizarre. But because it's so impractical, George will probably err on the side of caution and not send any potentially offending messages. It's not that the probation service monitors people's phones openly, but many Just Stop Oil activists suspect they are being watched, and for good reason. The British police did spy on activist groups for decades, hence the Spy Cops inquiry. Right-wing journalists have infiltrated Just Stop Oil meetings, and we've linked to Claire's story about that in the show notes. Either way, George feels like he is being watched and that he has no agency, just like when he was in prison.
I'm going to have to be incredibly careful about how I sort of conduct myself and how I speak to people, because I don't want to go back to prison, especially not for an entire sentence.
What I heard from George is that being on licence is in many ways harder than being in prison because of the uncertainty. When you're in prison, the rules are embodied through cell doors and visiting hours. But when you're out, you're sort of in this nebulous territory where the rules are much more loosely defined, but misinterpret them and you're right back in prison. George is therefore much more cautious on the outside than he was on the inside. He was quite relaxed about speaking to us on the podcast when he was actually in prison. If they cut off the call, they cut it off. If they told him off, they told him off. And that was the worst that could happen. But once George was released on licence, he cut off contact with us in the nicest way possible, because he was concerned that if his probation officer found out he was speaking to Novara media, he might get hauled back to prison.
As we heard in an earlier episode, Anna's family has also found the whole experience incredibly tough. They've been doorstepped by journalists, pulled into work meetings, and feel like they've really been through it themselves. Anna has promised them that they won't go out looking for trouble for the foreseeable future. Although that's not to say trouble won't come looking for them.
It has been incredibly hard on my family, and I do feel really horrible about putting them through what I have. And, you know, I can't promise that I will never get arrested again, mostly because of the increasingly repressive protest laws. You know, I could just be walking by a protest and get arrested because now I'm a known face.
Anna's action and imprisonment has had a huge ripple effect on the people around them. At least for now, Anna's activism is in retreat.
I will absolutely be thinking twice before, you know, doing anything as drastic as soup on sunflowers again. And, you know, for now, I've done my bit and now's my time to rest that other people can take my place.
But what people? Back in March, when Just Stop Oil revealed it would be hanging up the high vis and ending its campaign of direct action, the group said it had achieved its aim. Just Stop Oil's initial demand to end new oil and gas is now government policy, it said in a statement, making us one of the most successful civil resistance campaigns in recent history. But the fact is that many, or perhaps all of Just Stop Oil's most committed activists have done their bit. They've been to prison, and they don't want to repeat the experience for a while. Speaking to former inmates like George and Anna, you can hear that they're anxious about their future and paranoid about constantly being monitored. A lot of Just Stop Oil activists are simply burnt out, and they're not being replaced by enough new recruits to keep up their campaign of direct action. So this begs the question, is pursuing imprisonable action still a useful tactic for the climate movement?
I took this and a bunch of other questions to Roger Hallam. At 58 years old, Roger is a veteran of the climate movement and the co-founder of three of Britain's most notorious climate groups, Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain, and most recently, Just Stop Oil. Roger's currently in prison himself. In July 2024, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison after appearing on a Zoom call recruiting activists to take part in the M25 Gantries actions, the same actions that George Simonson eventually took part in. I wanted to know, why did Roger think Just Stop Oil should do these kinds of high-risk actions in the first place? Is it right to encourage people in your movement to risk going to prison? Is there something potentially exploitative about harnessing young people's rage and grief to sign them up to potentially life-ruining prison time? Roger is known for his provocative interview style, and true to form, he turned our entire interview on its head. We wanted to ask Roger all about Just Stop Oil's strategy. Why did he think the group needed to climb gantries and bridges and invade rugby pitches and flower shows? Was it productive for so many activists to be going to prison?
But according to Roger, Just Stop Oil didn't launch from a strategic question of what should we do. Instead, it began from an ethical question of what kind of people are we?
You don't start with strategy, you start with ethics. And that is, in a sense, a strategic move, because it's all sort of paradoxical. What me and Indigo were thinking is a desire to start with what it means to live a good life and what it means to be a human at a time of global obliteration.
Just Stop Oil didn't start with the question of what should we do. It started with the question of what kind of people are we?
Once that question is asked, then the meta-framing of the context changes, because the focus is on what it is to be a good person and what it is to be virtuous and all that sort of stuff, which obviously sounds like, you know, some vague Oxbridge sort of like thing. But you know, it doesn't actually mean that. What it means is do you want to be an arse or do you want to be cool? You know what I mean? If you want to be an arse, then you just carry on, you know, wandering around living your life while, you know, half the world's population are going to get fucked to death. Or are you going to do what it means to live a good life, which is obviously to be in resistance.
What Roger's saying is that Just Stop Oil's strategy isn't the outcome of some theoretical war games the group ran. Instead, it flows naturally and quite easily from a deep sense of responsibility towards other beings. Of course, that sense then gets developed into a strategy, Roger says, but you can't start with strategy. Ethics come first.
When deciding whether we want to do things, including going to prison for our politics, Roger argued that most people, including us at Novara Media, run a cost-benefit analysis and come down on the side of prioritising ourselves.
And to some extent, Roger is right. That is what Clare and I have been doing throughout this podcast. Could we hack the isolation of prison? What would it mean for our families, our future careers, our prospects of owning a home? What would the upsides be, and would they outweigh the downsides?
But for Roger, Just Stop Oil is about letting go of that mindset and starting simply with ethics.
Once you've let that one go, then the world becomes loads more interesting because you can create cultures that look upon going to prison as no big deal, to cut a long story short.
I see what Roger is getting at here. The Just Stop Oil prisoners we spoke to do seem to have found prison much less stressful than we imagined we would. That's because all of them are committed to the climate movement in a way that has reframed the experience of prison in their minds. That said, the activists we've spoken to have also found prison difficult at times. There have been dark moments for pretty much all of them, in fact. We asked Roger whether the suffering of Just Stop Oil prisoners weighs on him.
Obviously, you have responsibility, and obviously, unless you're really weird, you feel guilty and, distressed when people get traumatized or experience distress through their activism. But I think the real question is how the responsibility should be enacted.
Clearly, Roger does feel a sense of responsibility for his fellow activists. But what he's more interested in is how Just Stop Oil should act on that sense of responsibility. Should it stop doing anything which might traumatize anyone? His answer is firmly no. But he did admit that the group could better prepare its activists for the experience of prison. Roger also said that there was a danger of prioritizing individual harm over the collective good.
That individual harm, in some cases, is the prison time served by Just Stop Oil activists. It can also be the impact of Just Stop Oil's actions on members of the public, being delayed on your way to work by a slow march, for example. Roger says that all of that is negligible in the face of climate collapse.
The fact of the matter is any form of collective action involves risk. If you have a demonstration, someone's not going to be able to get to the hospital, aren't you a nasty person? Obviously, you to a certain extent, it's legitimate to make a sort of trade-off that there will be a certain amount of suffering in order, obviously, to prevent far greater suffering, which is going to be imposed on people.
I think a lot of people would agree with Roger's framing there. It is, in a way, really noble and politically useful to have your individuality subsumed into a movement that's much bigger than you. And I think he is highlighting an imbalance that we do have in politics more widely, where, it's always me and my feelings first rather than thinking about the greater good. And I do think that maybe at particular moments in history, we probably could benefit from a bit less self-centering. What do you think, Rivkah?
Yeah, I think I agree. And I think Just Stop Oil is really pushing in an opposite direction to a lot of other left-wing movements. And I actually think, there's something quite refreshing about Just Stop Oil's approach, which is to say, we do not want to put our activists at risk, and we will work to try and safeguard people. But ultimately, we are dealing with a brutal prison system and a brutal state repression. And you cannot make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. And that's potentially the inevitable outcome of what they're doing. The system is harmful and the repression will also be harmful. I also think there's something quite interesting about thinking about whose distress matters, right? There are millions of people who are in torturous levels of distress on a daily basis as a result of the actions of our government. They tend not to live in the UK, and they tend not to be white, middle-class climate activists, which many of the people that we've spoken to are. But their distress at least in the opinion of someone like Roger Hallam, is just as important as a Just Stop Oil activist distress. Having said all that, it's important to note that we're not always just talking about ordinary levels of distress. In some cases, I think we're talking about levels of mental distress that wouldn't be acceptable to anyone. I'm thinking in particular of Xavier Gonzalez Trimmer, the 22-year-old Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain activist who in February 2023 took his own life while on a GPS tag awaiting trial in 6 different court cases. Xavier had been in prison on remand once before, where he had a deeply unpleasant experience with his cellmate and was also facing mounting court fees. At the coroner's hearing following her son's death, Xavier's mum read from a psychiatric report that said Xavier had found his time in prison traumatic. In a Facebook post, Just Stop Oil said Xavier's friends believe his experience of prison and the restrictive electronic tag curfews in his final months contributed to his suicide.
Several of the Just Stop Oil activists we spoke to for this podcast pointed out that the group does try and identify people who might be putting themselves up for actions, the consequences of which they aren't prepared for. But Xavier's case shows that the effects of prison and of licence can be unpredictable. Is that a risk Roger's willing to take?
The first thing to say is obviously it's enormously upsetting because a lot of people knew him and liked and loved him a lot because he was a great guy, including myself. That's the first thing. The second thing is no one can say why he did what he did, not least because it wasn't really that clear.
Roger went on to say that Just Stop Oil does safeguarding. It will tell people not to participate in civil disobedience if they're clearly vulnerable. He added, though, that there is an irreducible amount of risk at the heart of Just Stop Oil's actions. But then, he said, there's also a huge risk if the group doesn't do anything.
There's a balance, and then the other balance obviously has to be that 4 billion people are going to die if we don't sort out the climate crisis. So it's very difficult for people to like to think in black and white terms about where those balances are. And I think the best we can do is to be very aware of our imperfection in regard to trying to create those balances.
We asked Roger, if the government's repression gets increasingly intense and activists start going to prison in much greater numbers and with much longer sentences, should the climate movement consider changing its tactics? His answer? Absolutely not. On the contrary, Roger suggested he wants more imprisonments, not as a standalone mission, but as part of a broad strategy that includes other types of resistance as well. In fact, Roger suggested a critical mass that would force the government's hand would be around 500 people, 20 times the number of Just Stop Oil activists that are currently in prison.
I think it's a fair bet that prison will now be seen as part of the standard repertoire of contention, as it were, in British politics, because a critical mass of people have been to prison. So it's no longer seen as something weird, individualistic, or a one-off, as it were, but more something that's systematic and culturally embedded in what resistance means.
But Roger was also clear when we spoke that he thinks this kind of uprising won't happen overnight, like it seemed to with the Arab Spring.
You can't just, jump into action like in Tahrir Square. You need a build-up of several years to create the cultural and organisational infrastructures to support people so that when 1,000 people do go to prison because 1 million people died in Phoenix, Arizona, then it's not a complete shit show organisationally and ethically and, psychologically for people. You see what I mean? It's like, okay, we know how to do it.
You need a slow build-up of organising, Roger said, so that when a trigger event happens that makes people want to get involved in the climate movement, a mass heat wave in Phoenix, Arizona, the hottest city in America, for example, the climate movement is ready to absorb them. But then, does going to prison even work? Does it actually change anything? Roger, of course, was pretty adamant it does.
There's no doubt in my mind, and you know this because I've said it, 100 times over the last 10 years, is the single most effective way to change society is to engage in resistance, avoid going to prison. to pretend that prison isn't a necessary and inevitable part of social struggle is you're just in a dream world, right? And obviously, dare I say it, particularly the Western middle-class activism has been in a dream world for the last 30 years, why it's never got anywhere, because it doesn't take seriously its responsibilities to the majority world.
Roger makes a compelling argument for why going to prison might be the right thing to do. But I think there's still a question here about whether it's the most effective thing to do. Has the imprisonment of Just Stop Oil activists actually benefited the climate movement? Rivkah, what do you think?
So I definitely hear what Roger says about prison being integral to resistance struggles in history. The anti-apartheid struggle, the Irish Republican struggle, all have incorporated prison in some way and to varying degrees of success. I think perhaps what's different about Just Stop Oil is, well, one, the numbers, like Roger says, that there aren't huge numbers of them. And so for them to attract attention is a lot more difficult. And perhaps, therefore, they do need to think about increasing the numbers of people that they have in prison in order for there to be a kind of crisis for the government. I think, though, the danger, obviously, of Just Stop Oil, as of all kind of direct action groups, is the backlash that they have prompted from the state, and particularly Labour government's susceptibility to that backlash, because they're concerned, and we know that the Labour government is kind of generally concerned with attack lines from the right and the far right. They're concerned about being accused of being in the pocket of Just Stop Oil, effectively, and being activists. That's why we saw at the Labour Party conference a couple of years ago them saying that they were the party of power, not protest. And there is actually a danger that the Labour Party is trying to prove itself as being even harsher on Just Stop Oil activists than a Tory government would have been. So I think, yes, they've made a name for themselves. Yes, I think actually they probably have raised the kind of political consciousness of the general public, but they also have created this kind of tension and danger of backlash, which could be productive, but it could also be counterproductive. We've sort of yet to see. What do you think?
So yeah, I think you're right to identify that Just Stop Oil has been really successful in shining a light on prisons and on authoritarianism at the same time as it's, received this backlash. But for me, there's also this bigger question. Has Just Stop Oil decisively changed the UK government's energy policy, as it was set up to do? Just Stop Oil's key demand was for the government to stop giving out new oil and gas licences. And shortly after coming to power last year, the new Labour government promised to do just that. But there is a problem. Licences, which have been stopped, aren't the same as oil fields themselves. That means it's entirely possible that drilling will continue to expand under existing licences. Robert Palmer, he's the Deputy Director of Uplift, told Novara Media that the next few months would be critical, with the government still needing to implement its manifesto commitment to ending new licences. We're also still awaiting decisions on whether the huge Rosebank oil field and the Jackdaw gas field will be blocked. So yes, while Just Stop Oil has undoubtedly forced a confrontation with power, which is what effective movements from history have always done, when it comes to having a direct impact on the UK's carbon emissions, it's perhaps too soon to say. So what next? Lots of people who were involved in Just Stop Oil are now taking a step back from direct action in order to focus on a direct democracy project called Assemble, whose idea is to replace the House of Lords with a body called the House of the People. Others will no doubt keep on doing direct action, perhaps with the Just Stop Oil offshoot called Youth Demand, or with Shut the System, a group that's been sabotaging fibre optic cables outside major insurance companies. This time, they're doing their best to make sure activists don't get arrested for it. Ultimately, though, it seems like we're at a juncture where the movement as a whole doesn't quite know what its next step should be.
Hi, I'm Pietro. I'm head of digital at Novara Media, and my team worked on the art for this show. Novara Media isn't just the people you see in front of the camera or hear behind the microphone. We are a team of over 20 staff, including social media editors, video producers, and the people who hold it all together, all working hard to build a different kind of media. The show you're listening to right now is made possible by all of us, and just as importantly, by thousands of small donations from people like you. If you'd like to support us, go to novara.media/support and give 1 hour's wage per month, or whatever you can afford. Thank you.
We're reaching the end of our journey with Britain's climate prisoners. But before we wrap up this fourth and final episode of Committed, I think we should revisit some of the questions we asked ourselves right at the start. So, Rivkah, you go first. Why did you want to make this podcast?
I think at the very basic level, I just thought we need to draw people's attention to the, frankly, huge numbers of political prisoners in this country, you know, dozens of people that are kind of out of sight and out of mind. And I think making this podcast, I've realized that my expectations of how sensational this story would be were somewhat disappointed. Luke, George, Anna, Rosa seem to actually have a much less traumatic experience of prison than I expected. And I think I realized that there's kind of something obvious about that, really, which is that they've self-selected for that experience. And that's okay, basically. You know, I think I see a lot of complaints in the media and on the left about how ethnically homogenous, for example, Just Stop Oil is, or the climate movement is. And to some extent that's fair, but I do actually think, looking at these Just Stop Oil prisoners, they have self-consciously identified themselves as privileged, white, sometimes middle class, and realized, actually, for someone like me, prison probably won't be that bad, and therefore I should do it. So I'm sort of less surprised now, and perhaps less judgmental of the kind of homogeneity of groups like Just Stop Oil. I'm like, good. In a way, Just Stop Oil is doing something quite helpful, which is saying, if you don't have that much to lose from prison, you are retired, you no longer have a career, you're young, you don't have a mortgage, you're white, middle class, you're not going to be deported, then maybe you should put yourself up for it. And I hope that they've kind of maybe encouraged more people to cash in the privilege that they're sitting on. If people did realize that, if more people were to realize that they have this kind of unexploited privilege, it would be a massive threat to the government, because prison would no longer be a deterrent for a larger and larger number of people. And that, like we talked about earlier, has the potential for radical social change. That said, I do think also making this podcast has made me realize that prison is really terrible for some people, some prisoners, including some we've talked about earlier, Xavier, some people in Palestine Action, and Palestine prisoners do have generally quite a different experience of prison because of the political prerogative to punish them and to make an example of them. But also there's this whole other group of people that we never talk about, which are the loved ones of people in prison. I think, you know, we've both seen up close how painful and how actually probably more painful it is for people on the outside than people on the inside, right?
Yeah, and I actually think it's this aspect that's going to stay with me the longest after we finish recording, you know, just how hard it is for the loved ones of people who are in prison for activism. I was so moved speaking to both Rosa and Angel. Rosa being in prison is so difficult for both of them, and Rosa doesn't have agency because she's literally locked up. Angel didn't choose for her partner to go to prison, and she kind of just has to wait and adapt in a way that I think is equally, if not more, difficult in many ways.
Yeah, I think the question of agency is really important here. You know, I think I felt that so much speaking to Luke's mum, which is she's a wonderful person and a really supportive parent, but she hasn't chosen this. And because she hasn't chosen this, the passage of time is just so different for her. And you notice this a lot. I mean, it's the same with George's girlfriend, for example, who's not a climate activist. It's a bit different for Angel because, as you said, she actually is an activist, and so she's a bit more on the same page as Rosa. But for Luke's mom or for George's girlfriend, they don't have that same sort of light at the end of the tunnel or sense of a mission or a commitment that motivates them through the experience, even on the outside. They're just kind of, why me? Like, why am I going through this? And every day feels really difficult. But you asked me why I wanted to make the podcast, and I said my reasons. So do you want to tell us a bit about why you wanted to make the podcast?
When we set out making it, I had this really clear aim in my mind, which was to really understand the psyche of someone who is willing to give up their freedom for a political cause. And I think in a way I was maybe, without realising it, looking for something special in these people that we were speaking to, something unique. I guess perhaps in a way to excuse myself from not doing something similar or not making the same sacrifices in many ways. But I think, and I guess I probably should have expected this, what we found out is that in many ways, these people aren't that different from me, or at least weren't before they did the actions that they did and went to prison. I think the different thing is, though, is that these people have a different community to the community that I have. And I do kind of wonder whether, had I taken a couple of different turns in my early 20s, I might have been friends with slightly different people. And maybe had I been in that community, I could have been one of these people at some point, just through the fact that being around so many other really committed people, or at least committed in this very specific way, does rub off on you and is such a key part of what sustains you through all the doubts and anxieties about like whether you're doing the right thing and whether it's worth it.
Yeah, I think that's very very honest of you. And I think I would say the same for myself. I've sort of made compromises with capitalism and the society that we live in exchange for certain material kind of comforts. In some ways, that makes me comfortable. But actually, part of me listening to Roger, or indeed to any of our activists that we've spoken to for Committed, it does make me feel like there's a kind of higher pleasure that they get from their commitments and from fulfilling what they feel is their sort of ethical destiny and living so completely in line with their values. So it has, I think, made me a little bit rethink what Roger would talk about as the cost-benefit analysis of like, do I want to give up my freedom? Like, will I be uncomfortable? And think of it more in terms of like, what might I gain from having such one-pointed like focus on, a political commitment? I think there's like a different way of looking at it, I guess. Do you imagine yourself ever changing your relationship to your kind of current comfort? Or do you think that, it's hard now? We're both now in our early 30s. We've both talked about wanting children or, having stability or things that maybe tie us down.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. And I think we don't know exactly how the next few years are going to play out, but we can make some pretty educated guesses. It's highly likely that climate breakdown will wreak even more havoc across the world and closer to home. And it's not at all inconceivable that in a few years we'll have a hard right party in power in the UK. And, I may well have kids by that point, which might make me turn away from these bigger issues into the immediacy of the everyday. But it also might lead me to feel like I have more stake in the future than I have right now and potentially drive me to greater action. Whether that's prison or not, I don't know. At the moment, I doubt it, whilst I'm definitely not at the point of being ready to take action for the climate that could get me sent to prison. I am open to the possibility that as things change around me, I might change as well. And I'm sure that goes for lots of people.
When you say that it rubs off on you, the relationships that we've created with these activists in the process of making this podcast has rubbed off on me. And like, I do feel a kind of transformative effect of contact with that kind of commitment. Like, it's quite difficult to not witness their kind of bravery and courage and empathy and clarity, like moral clarity, and feel inspired by it. And I think maybe that's ultimately why we want to publish this podcast, because I think that it's hard to not have some effect, minor or quite transformative, by simply just kind of like bearing witness to some of these people. And so, I guess my hope is that people will listen to this and see these people as their peers, as their community, and that might start a thought process that could lead somewhere interesting.
A lot has happened to the people we've met during the making of this podcast. For some, their time in prison is over, at least for now. Anna Holland is still adjusting to being out on licence and told us they have no plans to take imprisonable action anytime soon. But for Luke Elson, Rosa Hicks and Rory Wilson, their fates still hang in the balance. On the 20th of March 2025, Luke, Rosa and 6 more Just Stop Oil activists were found guilty of conspiring to cause a public nuisance at Heathrow Airport. All 8, along with Rory, who pleaded guilty in September, are due to be sentenced in mid-May. The maximum sentence for their crime is 10 years in prison, although so far no one's ever been given more than 5. They also aren't likely to be in prison as long as that, as they've already completed a chunk of their term on remand. Luke wasn't bailed for the trial. That means that bar a few prison visits, the only real-life contact he and his partner Phoebe Plummer have had since Phoebe got released in late February was in the courtroom of Isleworth Crown Court for his trial. I watched as Luke blew Phoebe kisses from the dock. Despite glass barriers and prison walls, they're still both very committed to the struggle and each other. When I spoke to Luke after his trial, he was relieved to no longer be on remand. Now the end is in sight, and soon he can start counting down the days to freedom. But the process has taken its toll.
That's the one thing I've struggled with a lot in prison. I don't really get a lot of mental respite. Like physically I feel rested, but mentally I don't feel very rested, and I'm unsettled and I'm struggling to find a bit of peace.
For Rosa, things are more complicated. Rosa was bailed in January after 6 months on remand. But with her fiancé Angel on the other side of the world in Australia, she hasn't seen her face-to-face for over 18 months. To make matters worse, this year Angel has been in and out of hospital dealing with several serious health conditions, culminating in emergency surgery. They're waiting to see what sentence Rosa receives before making any big decisions about the future of their relationship.
I think I was holding out some hope I could get acquitted from this and then just get on over to Australia and be able to support some of the recovery, even if just on a temporary visa and stuff. But where the conviction now leaves me in terms of everything, I'm not entirely sure.
Most people looking on at the situation that these Just Stop Oil activists are in might wonder, well, what was it all for? As individuals, taking this action doesn't look like it's done them much good. Luke and Rosa face potentially many more years locked up, unable to build lives with their partners. Others still face months on licence, unable to do any kind of activism at all, the very thing which brings meaning to their lives. And with the planet hurtling past 1.5 degrees of warming, from one angle, it doesn't really look like they've achieved much for the cause either. I put this to our activists. In the end, was it all worth it? And not one of them said they regretted it. Anna was the most enthusiastic. They said that despite how hard it was, they learnt so much from the experience of being in prison, and ultimately seemed glad it happened to them.
First thing I did when I got home to my Newcastle flat is I toasted the judge who sentenced me, thanking him for that time in prison, because I have come out of it so much stronger than when I went in.
For Rosa, it's not even just about the impact of activists going to prison. Much as Roger Hallam said earlier, Rosa is glad she did what she did because, to her, it felt like the right thing to do.
I'm not involved in this because I'm like, cool, I'll do things and the world will be saved. I'm doing it because I'm like, this feels like the right thing to do, even if it's not successful.
When I spoke to Luke, he reminded me of an important byproduct of their action, revealing an increasingly oppressive state for what it is.
There's a social tipping point which is happening. People might not agree with JSO's tactics or what they were doing, but they're starting to see the oppressive consequences of our actions and go, well, that's not right, that's disproportionate, that's not fair. And that's part of civil disobedience, and like JSO, or like what I've done is kind of developed into not just trying to get our government to take the climate emergency seriously, but also it's starting to point out how oppressive our state is becoming and how they treat peaceful protesters.
But being happy with their decisions so far doesn't necessarily mean these activists know where to put their energy next. At one time, the path forward felt clear. Now, things are a bit more hazy. For Rosa, even if she's out of prison sooner than expected, there are still some pretty big questions and uncertainties.
I don't know what other people's plans are, but for me, yeah, it is quite a overwhelming time, because before it's always been like, cool, we've just got a next action period, we'll try and do that, we'll try and move forward with that. And it's scary and a bit overwhelming to think about, because I think when I actually step back from the idea of these more single issue campaigns, just how big this problem is like really overpowering. And it does make me think, where does one start? It was simpler when we were just asking for no new oil and gas licenses, for example. That seemed like something that was okay and achievable.
Just Stop Oil's headline-grabbing campaign of direct action has come to a close after 3 years. For the activists we've spoken to on Committed, that means an end to their actions: road blocking, soup throwing, gantry climbing, and spray painting. It also marks the end of a major chapter in their lives, an all-consuming political project, one which provided them with an entire social world and linked their destinies forever. Understandably, that's going to be hard to replace, even if they wanted to. The last time I spoke to Rosa, she sounded perhaps more directionless than at any point over the months I've spent getting to know her. She was realistic about everything Just Stop Oil had achieved and couldn't achieve. But since she started taking imprisonable action for the climate, a lot has changed. It's too late now to stop the crisis altogether. And though a lot could still be done to make it less catastrophic, the fact is we're playing a different game.
Now, where I've had time to move on and reflect and think more about huge mass societal change and the importance around all of that, it seems even more of a mammoth task, because we've tried this Just Stop Oil single demand, and with fewer people, the state comes down on them.
It seems typical of Rosa, and in fact, all the other prisoners we spoke to, that even after everything she's been through, she remains as committed as ever. Just Stop Oil took the fight so far, and in the process, splashed the climate crisis across the front pages, both triggered and exposed an anti-democratic crackdown on protest, and, arguably, stopped some oil. Now, it's time for something different, Rosa told me. Something much, much bigger.
For me, it's really the idea of going back to this genuine mass mobilization, get everybody united, and yeah, maybe it's that way that we can actually completely change the system.
Committed is a podcast from Novara Media. It was reported and presented by Rivkah and Clare. The producers were Richard Hames and Chal Ravens. Music and sound editing was by Matt Huxley. Art direction was by Pietro Garone and Filippo Mara.
Thanks to all of the prisoners, their partners, friends and family members who spoke to us for this podcast. Thanks also to their prison buddies, Alex, Jamie, Kate and Pia. And thanks to Bertie Coyle from Just Stop Oil.
Hey, Rivkah here. Thank you to every single person who supports Novara Media with a monthly donation. You made this show and all of our journalism. Novara Media is on a mission to tell stories the rest of the media won't touch, and having no billionaire donors or advertisers means we can do just that. So if you've enjoyed Committed and want us to do more original, fearless journalism, go to novaramedia.com/support and give 1 hour's wage a month, or whatever you can afford.